Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is Art Van Walde, and I'm your host for today's program. Did you know that for every 9 people executed since the reinstatement of the death penalty in the United States, that one person on death row has been exonerated or set free? Think about that for a few moments. We'll be taking a look at capital punishment over the next 2 weeks through several different Christian perspectives. You'll see footage from a recent continuing education seminar held at CBI where author and speaker Shane Claiborne, Calvin Theological Seminary professor Dr. John Bolt, and senior research fellow at Calvin College's Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, Dr. Stephen Monsma, offered their views. Today, you'll hear from Shane Claiborne.
I should say I'm from Tennessee, in case you can't tell. And I grew up down south, and where we've got songs like "This house is protected by the good Lord and a gun, and if you come unwanted, you'll meet them both, son." So that's the land I came from, and so conversations around things like the death penalty, I don't feel like I really thought too much about that growing up, and even now, like I get to travel a lot, and I was in Texas, and I get to meet folks all the time. I feel like there's a lot of really good thinking on this happening, and I feel like I hope that our conversation, one, it just feels open to each other. As a one to this issue, it's been pretty new to me. I'm not like a death penalty activist or something like that. I moved into North Philadelphia, and our relationships have kind of driven everything for us, our relationship with Jesus and our desire to love our neighbor. And I incidentally, I have always given my books away to folks living in prison, and I started getting to know some of them because they'd write me letters, and I got to visit folks, that were on death row, and I got letters, and that's what started raising my attention around this. It wasn't an issue as much as it was people that I began to get to know that challenged a lot of my ways of thinking. So I do feel like it's worth saying as we get going in Michigan, like the deck is stacked against us a little bit, because y'all, like, I just read, you're the first English-speaking territory to abolish the death penalty. You did it like in 1847, so like that's a long time ago. So like in Tennessee, we just reinstated the death penalty with the electric chair. So we're I think they're probably all coming from different places, but for me, as I started looking at some of this, it's about the people and the faces first for me. I have one of the folks I got to meet recently was actually introduced to me by Heather here, who works with a great organization called Equal Justice USA. And it's a guy named, his name's Billy Neal Moore. And Billy's story is pretty interesting because it was a lot like the other stories I got letters from, but I got to meet him not too long ago when we did an event together. And he came back from the Vietnam War and was pretty troubled in a lot of ways. And one of those was financially. And he and an Army buddy ended up making a bad decision, which out of really a place of desperation, they decided to rob a house. And through that, the owner of that house was killed. And Billy felt the weight of that. And you can see his story told by himself online, and he wrote a book called Thou Shalt Not Die But Live. And so his story, though, as he tells it, he was so heartbroken by what he had done that he thought he deserved death. In fact, he wanted to kill himself. He tried to kill himself. He said, "I would have pushed the button on my own execution." But then something incredible happened. The family of the victim happened to be Christians, and they reached out to him, and they basically said, "We hate what you did, but we're Christians, and we believe that grace can have the last word. We believe in redemption, and we believe in Jesus." And through all sorts of wild and miraculous events, he's a little Pentecostal, so like all kinds of cool stuff happened. He ended up giving his life to Jesus. and then that victim's family basically became his family over the years. And they grew to love each other. And in fact, that family, the family of the victim, right, was the biggest, the loudest voice against his execution, insisting over and over that this story of Jesus is a story of salvation. It's a story of second chances. It's a story of redemption, right? And they argued against his execution, stopped it, and in a really wild and miraculous move, he was one of the only people ever to be released by the Georgia Parole Board. So he was released from prison, and today he's a pastor. Today he's a preacher, right? And I think that is the scandal of our faith, right? That's the scandal. And so I think it's so important to start there, that we believe in redemption, that this is a story that grace gets the last word. All through the Scripture, we've got some pretty messed up characters that still are redeemed by the grace of God, and I think of David, who I learned in East Tennessee in Sunday school, as a man after God's own heart. On good days, but he had some bad ones, right? Can I get a witness? Like, he had some bad days where he ended up lusting, committing an adultery. In 2 chapters, pretty much breaks every one of the 10 Commandments, right? And he ends up lying and, taking someone else's wife. He ends up having her husband, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, killed, right, to cover up what he's done. Yet he hears the rebuke of God, and he goes on to write, so many of the Psalms, the biggest book in the Bible written by this. And just as a side note, when David did that, he already had like 7 wives and 10 concubines. How many does a brother need, right? But he had a problem. He was a broken man. And I love the first chapter of the New Testament, where it is the genealogy that leads up to Jesus, right? And it says this was the son of, and it's easy to skip those, but if you look careful, it's beautiful because it goes through the whole genealogy leading to Jesus. And it gets that awkward part, though, with David and Bathsheba. And it says, and then Solomon was born, and Solomon was the son of David, but his mother was Uriah's wife. I'm glad like 3 of you got that. It's I think it was a joke. It was like, don't forget, that was a mistake, right? But God's grace was bigger than David's sin. God's love is bigger than our mistakes, and the story that leads up to Jesus continues. So I think that's the real beauty of this. Even, I think of another person who was a broken man, was Saul of Tarsus, right? Who by every definition was a terrorist, a murderer. He oversaw the killing of Stephen, the young man brutally killed, right? And he looked more like ISIS than a saint. And yet he is knocked off his horse, given this blinding vision. Here's Jesus say, "Why do you persecute me?" And he has such a radical conversion. He changes his name, and he becomes from Saul to Paul, and he goes on to write so powerfully about grace, right? And this love, and so I think as we think of this issue, for me, it's really about the core of our faith, which is if we believe that a murderer or a terrorist is beyond redemption, we could rip out half the Bible. The Bible would be a lot shorter without grace, And yet I'm thankful for grace, because I think that teaches us that someone like Billy Neal Moore, or someone like Saul of Tarsus, or David, or you, or me, even if we've taken someone's wife and had someone killed, we are still not beyond redemption. And so we hear that, but, I think what's disturbing for me is, I always thought the death penalty, that's political, and yet I am more convinced than ever. I've just been writing a book over the last few years on this, and I'm more convinced than ever that this isn't just a political issue. This is a spiritual thing. This is a faith issue. There's an incredible book that's meant a lot to me as I've wrestled with some of this. It's a book by Dale Resinella that's called The Biblical Truth About America's Death Penalty. Dale is a chaplain now, but he was a lawyer, and he's a biblical scholar, and he looks at a lot of the ways that we've read the Bible, because one of the things that Dale says is the death penalty has not succeeded in America in spite of Christians, but because of us. That the Bible Belt has become the death belt, he says. And if you look at the areas where executions have happened, over 80% of them have been in the Bible Belt, right? That we see even to this day. I mean, the death penalty is, I think and believe and hope that we're finding better forms of justice. But even right now, last year, three states accounted for 80% of the executions, right? And or most of the executions, and only 7 states actually executed last year. 7 states, and if we look at those, many of those are the places where we consider the Bible Belt, and we consider many of them are formerly Confederate slaveholding states. And I think about this, and I look, at the history of our country and some of the demons that we continue to wrestle with, and you can't help but see that there's a spiritual dynamic to what's happening, right? And so part of, I think what we've got to do is begin to read Scripture again, and to see that the first fruits of sin, right, are one of the first inaugural acts outside of the Garden of Eden is a brother killing a brother, right? The Cain and Abel story, that right as we see life outside the garden, we see violence and murder. And yet how God deals with that can help inform us, right? That God doesn't kill Cain, but actually he is reprimanded, of course, but he's also protected. God even goes so far as to say, if anybody tries to retaliate or hurt Cain, then you're going to have to deal with me. And he exiles Cain, so he certainly, it would be very similar to life in prison, only he was pushed out rather than locked in, but he's put out. So I think God deals with the sin and the violence without a doubt, and God's concern is certainly to protect life. But God doesn't enact the death penalty, right? And as we look at Moses and other stories, we see that. And as I think back, to my own upbringing and thinking, where did I come to justify the death penalty as a Christian? A Christian who reads the Bible and takes it very seriously, I think I started with the verse, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? That is one of the verses we see over and over. And the more you look at that, though, the more you see that this idea, the lex talionis, as it said, is from where we get kind of the concept of retaliation, equal harm for equal harm done. But I came to see that, I think, originally, that this was kind of a license for revenge, but it's actually a limitation of it. It was to stop the progressive patterns of violence, right? So as to say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but no more. So if somebody pokes your eye out, you can't go poke both of their eyes out, right? Like if someone breaks your arm, you can't go break both their arms and buckle their legs. Like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, no more. And in light of that, it makes a lot of sense to me that Jesus comes as the fulfillment of the law, right? Like not a negation of it, but a fulfillment of it. So Jesus is going to say, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I'm going to tell you, don't even take their eye out, right? I'm going to show you a better way. And it's that which you might think of it. Dale says, you got different laws of mandate and laws of limitation, right? A law of mandate says you have to do this. A law of limitation says you can do, like, for instance, drinking, right? The blood alcohol content is allowed to be 0.08, by the way, just in case you think I did my research. I haven't been pulled over or something, but it's 0.08. That doesn't mean that you should, but it means that there's a limitation. Like you can drive 55 is a mile per hour limit, but it doesn't mean that we have to drive 55. And I think similar to that is this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that we certainly may have a legal right, but that doesn't mean it's right.
Correcting Bible study lessons is crucial to helping inmates. To partner with CBI in this safe and secure role, please visit us at cbi.fm on the web.
So Jesus teaches us, I think, a more perfect and beautiful way to interact with evil without mirroring it. And as we think of the crimes that were death worthy, that's another thing that stunned me. I would say, well, we need to, if you take someone's life, you deserve to die. And but then I started to look at the scripture, and that wasn't the only death-worthy crime, right? There were 30 or so of those, including breaking the law on the Sabbath, which pretty much everybody but Chick-fil-A would be in trouble, I think. But you had like laws that like you couldn't do sorcery or idolatry and different kinds of sexual activity. All were death-worthy crimes. In fact, even in the States, the early colonies, some of those were death penalty crimes here. So what we kill people for has evolved, but it's also kind of important to see that backdrop, right, of history as we think about the death penalty today, that even though we do only kill people for the crime of murder, that's not always been the case, and so that was all helpful for me as I thought about this issue. And then, I started to learn a lot of other things outside of Scripture that just in the world that we live in, the issue of innocence is a really big one, right? So I did this event that Heather helped organize. Where was it? In Nebraska, I think it was. That we met this man named Curtis McCarty, and this was his opening line. "Hello, my name is Curtis. I spent my entire life in jail for a crime that I didn't commit." And I can remember hearing that and going, my gosh, what must that be like, right? And then I began to see that, Curtis isn't alone, but there's actually over 150 people that have been exonerated, found innocent of the crimes that they were convicted of. Some of them just hours before their execution, that they lived with this agony and terror of almost seeing their life taken away for a crime they didn't commit. And that's for every 9 executions, there's been one exoneration. I think, man, what if one of every train's wrecked, one of every 10 trains wrecked or something? We would we would redo the whole thing, right? We would rethink the whole thing. And I think as the issue of innocence is certainly one. And another is the issue of poverty, that you see a guy that's become a friend and I think is a hero when it comes to the death penalty. He's also a man of deep faith. There's a guy named Bryan Stevenson. He's a death penalty lawyer. He went to the same school I did, so I can brag on him a little bit. He went to Eastern University in Philly, and then went to Harvard, graduated with honors, came out of Harvard, and now he's down in Alabama. He's started the Equal Justice Initiative down there. He was just named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. Desmond Tutu called him America's young Nelson Mandela. He's an amazing guy. And but he said, even if you believe in the death penalty, he said, I started to look at Alabama and see that we're not killing guilty people. We're not killing the worst of the worst. We're killing the poorest of the poor. We're killing those who can't afford good lawyers. The most common denominator when it comes to execution is economics. And he said, you're better off being guilty and rich in America than poor and innocent. It's a powerful line, right? And so he is an incredible lawyer and just had a major exoneration down in Alabama and is doing work all over the country around this. And so that the issue of poverty is certainly one. And so is the issue of race. That one of the things that Bryan did connected to their work is show the connecting between where we've had a history of lynching and where we currently have the practice of the death penalty. And 8 in 10 lynchings in the late 19th century, early 20th century, were in the same places that we're having 8 in 10 executions, right? And so we look at the patterns of race and the legacy of racism in our country. And please, we remember, I think we have to confess and lament that some of this was being done by white folks with a Bible in our hand that were in church on Sunday morning. And we're doing some of the most horrific stuff I could ever imagine. I mean, this is stuff that as I'm researching for my book, it's keeping me up at night, haunting me, right? The stuff that I read that I never knew about. Some of it happened 2 hours from where I grew up in Tennessee, right? And so we look at that. But even now, like, I can read about history, but then I go, yeah, but that's lynching. That's, back then. But then I got to hear about a man in Texas that's still on death row, a man named Dwayne Buck. And he was found guilty in Texas. And in order to be executed in Texas, one of the issues that the prosecution has to argue is future dangerousness, right? Like that this person is in imminent danger, and they have to prove that. And in Dwayne's case and several others, the prosecution called expert witness that brought race in as a contributing factor to the future dangerousness. So basically saying, like, men are more violent than women, black folks are more violent than white folks. And this was actually a part of the testimony that was led him to where he is now, which is still facing execution. And yet, Dwayne Buck is a lover of Jesus. He's folks call him Pastor Buck because he's a pastor inside the jail. In fact, even guards talk about how he's torn down the hostilities that are there, and he's this presence of peace that's there. And you think after almost 20 years in prison, he's never been written up for anything, and yet he's facing execution because race was one contributing factor in the future dangerousness of whether or not he deserved to live. And his life is on the line, So that's part of what, fires my soul in all of this. And then as I researched for my book, I never really thought about part of what I thought about is the victims, but I think I only thought about anytime you talk about the death penalty, we always naturally think like, but what about the victims, right? And we absolutely should. I mean, my gosh, I believe that God's heart breaks anytime our heart breaks, especially when someone loses the life of someone they love. So, but then I began to read one story after another of victims who were against execution for all kinds of different reasons, many of them because of their faith. These murder victims' families were compelled to insist that there's better ways of healing. There's better ways of justice than taking a life. And when we allow someone who kills to make us someone who kills, we glorify evil and death rather than transcend it. And so these families, like the Journey of Hope and Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation, Murder Victims' Families for Human Rights, are some of my heroes. And I also began to hear something that was a bit haunting to me, is that we often hear of murder victims' families that are for execution, but not many that are against execution. And as I got to know many of them, I began to hear that part of the reason for that is if you are a murder victim family that whatever reason, your loved one was killed and you don't want execution for the offender, then there are all kind of obstacles that are put into your place to speak out. In fact, there are cases where there's essentially been a gag order put on the victim's family, or they've been threatened to be an obstruction of justice if they give voice to anything other than execution. In one case of the Lamb family in Nebraska, they were the immediate family of the person killed was against execution, and as the sentencing went and as the execution was being argued for, they were against it. And Nebraska has a lot of laws for the victims, right? And so they actually had to rule in Nebraska that the Lamb family were not victims in the traditional sense, because they didn't actually fit. And so some of the immediate family members that were against execution were not allowed to voice their opinion, while the family members that were for execution, they were allowed to give their voice. And then there's another case that was so troubling where the woman, this one little girl, her dad was killed, and she was beaten almost unconscious. In fact, she kind of played dead in order to survive, and she lived through the agonizing trauma of this crime. And as she went to trial, she didn't want the person who did it to be killed. And on trial, the judge says, if you say anything about that, then you are in danger of contempt of court. And she said, in that moment, I felt like I went from the one who was giving witness, to the one who was on trial. And you think about this little girl, and part of what happens, right, when you're victimized is you feel helpless and powerless. And when we don't allow folks' voices, that's deeply troubling. And many of these are people of faith, right? That their faith drives them to believe that there are better ways of justice than killing, to show that killing is wrong. So in the end, those are some of the things that move me. But then I also never really thought about like how it affects those who execute, right? And you think about this, like there's a guy named Ron McAndrew that I interviewed, who, I mean, he is by no means a softie. He was a prison warden, right? He's a pretty tough, like, you do the crime, you do the time kind of dude. And he was overseeing executions in Florida. And he's like, as they're doing this one execution, it's by electric chair, the man's head catches on fire. And he's traumatized, right? And they continue to do execution. In fact, he said, so we decided that's messed up. You know, we're gonna explore lethal injection. He goes and gets trained in lethal injection. And then he says, but these guys that I was responsible for their execution, they continued to visit me in my sleep. And it sent him on this sort of spiritual journey, this soul quest, right? And he came back feeling very strongly that we just are not meant to kill. We're just not meant to kill. And I hear that, and I hear other executioners like Donald Cabana, and even folks that I've been at speaking events like this, and they'll come up afterwards and say, I was on the death team, and I just know that's not what we're created to do. And you think of those even like in the recent executions in Indonesia, 8 folks were killed, and they talked about how, they put hoods on the folks so they don't have to see them, and one executioner in the firing squad has a blank, right, so that they don't, so maybe all of them could be innocent of taking someone's life, and yet in this recent execution, those who were executed, 2 of them were devout Christians, maybe more, but I know 2 of them were because I know their families, they refused to wear the hoods. They wanted to look into the eyes of those who were going to kill them, and as they did, and they were being killed for drug offenses, for being convicted of drug offenses, and as they were executed, they looked into the eyes of those who were taking their life, and they sang Amazing Grace, and they sang, Bless the Lord, O my soul. And I think of that. I think part of our job in all of this is to humanize what's at stake, right? To realize that every human being is created in the image of God. Even if that's the person that's executing holding the gun, it does something to their soul. It does something to us when we kill. Whether we do it as an illegal crime or whether we do it as a legal function of the state. When we kill, it does something to our soul. And in the end, I'll say that what really forms my entire world is Jesus. I'm in love with Jesus. I've devoted my life to Jesus. So Jesus is kind of the framework through which I try to look at the world and not allow just the dominant political conversation to hijack everything, but allow Jesus to be the lens through which I think about something like the death penalty.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Crossroad Connection. Be sure to catch part 2 for the rest of Shane Claiborne's thoughts on capital punishment, as well as responses from Dr. John Bolt and Dr. Stephen Monsma. If you're interested in attending upcoming seminars, check out our website, cbi.tv, to find out more and sign up. We hope to see you again right here next week.